The land of Judah once knew the sound of life, rustling leaves, running water, and voices filled with hope. But a day came when everything fell silent. Fields that had once carried the weight of abundance now stood colorless, stripped of their beauty, as if creation itself had forgotten how to breathe. The soil cracked like broken pottery under the scorching sun, and each dry fissure seemed to whisper the same truth. Something sacred had been lost. Wave after wave of locusts had descended on the land, with an appetite that felt almost supernatural. They devoured grain, bark, fruit, leaves. Nothing survived their passage. Even the young shoots, symbols of tomorrow, vanished under their relentless hunger. What remained was a landscape that resembled grief itself. The barns stood hollow, the wine presses dry, and the altars abandoned. The people wandered between disbelief and exhaustion, unsure of how to interpret the desolation around them. But among the ruins, while many saw only devastation, Joel began to see something different, something deeper than famine, more urgent than material loss. He walked through the devastated vineyards with tears clouding his vision, not a penis because the land was dying, but because he sensed that the barrenness of the soil reflected the barrenness of the people's souls. There was a spiritual drought underneath the physical one, a disconnect between the nation and its God, and Joel could feel it pulsing like a hidden wound. As others shut their eyes to survive the moment, Joel's spiritual senses awakened. It was as if the silence of the fields had become the voice of God whispering, "Wake up!" And Joel, trembling yet attentive, understood that he could not remain quiet. He had been chosen to give meaning to what others could not comprehend. So he lifted his voice in a moment when every other voice had been swallowed by despair. Joel was not a man of titles, nor someone eager for attention. He was a witness, standing between heaven and earth, interpreting the invisible. He perceived that the calamity was not merely a tragedy, it was a message. The locusts were not just insects, but a warning, a divine interruption meant to remind the people that they had drifted too far from the one who sustained their breath. Joel felt the urgency of a man carrying a fire in his chest. He recognized that God, em sua misericordia, sometimes uses shaking to awaken what has fallen asleep. And if the people refused to pause, to feel, to question, they might miss the very purpose of the pain they were enduring. As the prophet spoke, there was something in his tone that startled the hearts of those who listened. Not condemnation, but truth, spoken with a love strong enough to wound and heal. He declared that the crisis was not the end, but the beginning of a divine call. His words moved through the desolate streets like wind entering a stifled house, pulling down the numbness that had hardened the nation. Joel urged every person, elders, leaders, women, children, newly married couples, to gather before God with honesty, fasting, and brokenness, not with garments torn for show, but with hearts torn open in sincerity. He knew that rituals alone could not restore a land that had forgotten humility. Only true repentance could turn divine judgment into divine mercy. And for the first time in a long time, the people began to feel the weight of their distance from God. As Joel watched the people slowly gather, he felt a fragile shift in the atmosphere, something subtle, like the first cool breeze after a suffocating day. The cries that rose from the city were no longer empty expressions of fear, but echoes of souls remembering who they truly belonged to. The priests, once silent and powerless, now stood between the porch and the altar, with clothing stained in ashes, pleading for mercy with voices that trembled not from despair but from reverence. Joel witnessed men and women who had lived distracted for years now falling to their knees with newfound clarity. They realized that the calamity had peeled away every illusion of self-sufficiency. What remained was the truth. Without God, every field becomes desert, every plan becomes dust, every heart becomes hollow. And as brokenness spread through Judah like a holy contagion, Joel sensed that heaven was leaning close. He could not see God's response, but he could feel it, soft, gentle, almost imperceptible, like a hand brushing away tears. The prophet had no guarantee of what would happen next, but he trusted the character of the God he served. He knew that divine justice is never separated from divine compassion. He felt deep within his spirit that when people return to God with sincerity, something always changes. If not first on the earth, then surely in the realm unseen. The cries of repentance, rising from a nation on its knees, carried the fragrance of humility that God never ignores. And Joel waited in hope. believing that restoration was already forming beyond what human eyes could perceive. Then, like dawn breaking after an endless night, a word came, soft yet powerful, comforting yet majestic. Joel stood in the midst of the people and spoke not as a man, but as a vessel overflowing with divine promise. The God who had allowed the land to be shaken now declared restoration. Fields that had been eaten to the bone would sprout again. The winepresses that had run dry would overflow. The ground that had wept under the locusts' devastation would once again dance with life. God promised not only to renew what had been lost, but to give back what the locusts had consumed, as if time itself would be rewritten by his mercy. The people listened with trembling hope, their hearts slowly warming like embers reigniting in the cold. But Joel went even further, revealing a promise so tender and vast that it silenced every remaining whisper of doubt. God would return to dwell among them, not as a distant observer, but as a faithful presence, close enough to be felt in the rhythm of daily life. The restoration would not be superficial. It would touch the soil, the soul, the seasons, and the spirit. The rains that had been withheld would fall again in their appointed times. The harvest would return, stronger than before. The fragrance of joy would replace the scent of ashes, and the people who had once hung their heads in shame would lift their faces, knowing they were seen, forgiven, and cherished. For Joel understood a sacred truth. When a heart is truly broken before God, the path to favor is already open. Even as the promise of restoration stirred hope within the people, Joel knew his message was not complete. There was a truth far greater than ruined fields and renewed harvests, a truth that pointed toward the unfolding of divine history itself. So, with the same voice that once announced judgment and later proclaimed healing, Joel lifted his eyes toward a horizon far beyond his own generation. He spoke of a day unlike any other, a moment when God would intervene directly in the affairs of humanity. He called it the great and dreadful day of the Lord, a time when every heart, every nation, and every hidden deed would stand exposed before the one who sees all things. This day would not be defined by earthly armies or political turmoil, but by the unveiling of perfect justice. Joel described scenes that felt almost too heavy for human imagination: darkness covering the skies, trembling across the earth, and a force so fearsome that even the bravest would find their strength melting like wax. It was not meant to paralyze the people, but to awaken them. He wanted them to grasp the gravity of their choices, to understand that life was not a series of empty routines, but a journey toward a divine encounter no one could escape. The locusts had devastated the land, but their destruction was only a faint shadow compared to the spiritual reckoning that awaited humanity. Yet even in the midst of these intense warnings, Joel's message carried a pulse of mercy. He emphasized that this terrifying day was not meant to destroy the repentant, but to offer clarity, revealing the path of salvation to everyone willing to walk it. Then Joel revealed a promise so unexpected, so revolutionary, that it would echo across centuries and reshape the spiritual destiny of the world. God, he proclaimed, would pour out his Spirit on all flesh, not on a chosen few, not on kings or prophets alone, but on sons and daughters, on the young who dreamed of the future, and on the elderly whose lives were rich with memory. Even servants, those overlooked and forgotten by society, would become carriers of divine revelation. The presence of God would no longer be confined to temples or rituals. It would live within people, breathing visions into hearts, stirring prophecy from ordinary lips, and awakening dreams that came from heaven itself. Joel saw a time when God's voice would not be distant, but as near as breath. The people listened with awe, unsure of how to grasp something so vast. Many had grown up believing that intimacy with God was reserved for a select group. Yet Joel was proclaiming a future where God would dwell within anyone who opened their lives to him. This was more than restoration. It was transformation. It was the beginning of a relationship between heaven and humanity that transcended tradition and shattered limitation. Joel spoke of signs that would accompany this coming era: wonders in the heavens, trembling in the earth, symbols that would speak to the conscience of every living soul. And then, with a voice full of both solemnity and hope, he declared one of the most beautiful truths ever spoken: everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Not some, not the worthy, not the strong. Everyone, anyone who turns to God with sincerity will find a refuge no calamity can shake. As Joel's visions unfolded, his message began to stretch beyond individuals and even beyond the borders of Judah. The prophet saw a future moment when God would gather all nations into a single place of accountability, a valley appointed not for debate, but for truth. Joel called it the Valley of Judgment, the place where God would expose centuries of injustice, cruelty, exploitation, and pride. No empire would be too powerful to stand before him, no ruler too influential to avoid his gaze. There, before the throne of perfect righteousness, every act of violence, every betrayal, every oppression hidden behind earthly power would be brought into the light. Joel's voice trembled not with fear, but with the overwhelming weight of divine justice. He understood that God's judgment was not revenge. It was the restoration of a world that had long suffered under the weight of human corruption. But even as he described the shaking of nations, Joel spoke tenderly of God's unwavering loyalty to his people. The oppressed would be defended. The scattered would be gathered. Those who had borne shame would be lifted high. The same God who confronted the arrogance of the nations would wrap his arms around those who trusted in him. Joel painted a picture of a world finally set right, a world where evil no longer had the final word, where the scales of justice at last balanced with divine precision. And although the vision was intense, it carried the fragrance of hope. God sees, God remembers, and God will not allow wickedness to reign forever. After unveiling these scenes of judgment and cosmic upheaval, Joel ended his message not with fear, but with a breathtaking promise. Beyond the valley of decision lay a future filled with peace, abundance, and the fullness of God's presence. The dry land would be watered by springs flowing from the very heart of God's dwelling place. Wilderness would bloom again, not only in the soil, but in the souls of the people. Safety would return as a permanent guest, not a passing visitor. No enemy would invade their peace. No shadow of fear would pierce their nights. The Lord himself would dwell among them, not as a symbol, not as a memory, but as a living presence felt in every breath, every sunrise, every moment of stillness. Joel declared that the people would finally know, without doubt or confusion, that God was their Lord, and that his faithfulness would never again allow them to be humiliated or forgotten. Their identity would no longer be shaped by past failures or sorrows, but by the unshakable reality of belonging to the God who restored them. In Joel's vision, the greatest gift was not fertile land, nor prosperity, nor security. It was communion, a renewed relationship between Creator and creation, a life lived in the warmth of his nearness. And as the prophet's words reached their conclusion, the message crystallized into a timeless invitation. Joel's journey from devastation to repentance, from warning to restoration, revealed the heart of a God who speaks through crisis, calls through brokenness, and heals through mercy. His prophecy is more than an ancient text. It is a mirror held before every generation. It teaches that adversity can awaken us, that repentance opens the door to renewal, that the Spirit of God is available to all who seek him, and that history itself is moving toward a divine encounter where justice and love will stand side by side. Joel's voice, echoing across ages, reminds us that God is never silent in our darkest seasons. He whispers through loss, strengthens through faith, and restores through grace. And for every soul willing to call upon his name, the path to refuge and hope remains forever open.